Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to show you Bobby Fischer's best Sicilian games in my opinion. By the way, I'm sorry about the darkness, it's just dawning, so it should be light soon. I'm also sorry about the waves crashing and the crickets and the owls and all the other nature sounds. I'm outside. So Bobby Fischer is one of the most famous Sicilian players of all time, and I'm going to show you 5 of his games, starting with his game in the 1956 Junior Championship played in the US and ending with the final game of the Fischer-Spassky World Championship match, after which Spassky lost the match and Fischer became the world champion. So let's get started. So the first game is Kenneth Blake, who I don't know who he is, to be honest. So he played e4. Fischer played c5, of course, and we have the Boleslavsky variation. So Fischer is very famous for his Najdorf with black, and he's also famous for his Sozin attack, or Fischer-Sozin, actually got named after him, with white. But he didn't always play the Najdorf with black. This is actually a Boleslavsky variation. So d4, cd, knight d, everything standard so far, knight c3. And the Najdorf, of course, is a6, and that's what Bobby Fischer most commonly played, and later on in his career that's what he played all the time. But in this game he went for the classical variation with d6, and after bishop e2 followed it up with e5. Of course, white doesn't have to play bishop e2, black doesn't have to play e5, but this is one of the critical lines. It's called the Boleslavsky variation, and it's basically the Najdorf with e5 but without a6. So white has the option to play knight b5. It's not good. The main move is knight f3. White played knight b3, which is fine. It's the second most common move. Bishop e7, castles, and the great thing about this game is that Fischer's opponent resigned in a dead drawn equal position, and when we get to that point I wonder if you'll be able to find the draw. I mean, hopefully you wouldn't resign like Kenneth Blake here. So castles and f4. And this is all very, very standard in the Boleslavsky. White is starting a kingside attack. Black is going to play on the queen side. And Fischer, as he wrote in his 60 memorable games, actually annotating one of the games I'm going to show you, Unzicker Fischer, which is my favorite game, he says, in these positions you play bishop e6 to provoke f4, f5 to weaken the king's pawn. So one of the ideas in these structures is to play bishop e6, get white to play f5, and then you have a target on e4. But first a5. So he wants to play a4, and the knight would be misplaced, so a4 by white. And in this position he made a mistake, so he wasn't always perfect. And this first game I'm going to show you is 3 years earlier than his games in the candidates in '59, and you can see an astonishing difference in his skill level, theoretical knowledge, not so much in his tactical understanding, but the games were definitely much better later on. So here he played bishop e6, which is a slight inaccuracy, and white should be better now. After f5, I mean, you should retreat to d7, but he did not. He took on b3. And now white was simply better. Excuse me. What he should have done instead is theory today. He should have gone knight b4. And after knight b4, white should continue the attack with f5, g4, bishop g5, and so on. And white should start with king h1. After king h1, bishop e6 is now very standard. f5, as we said. Bishop d7 and bishop g5 and so on and so on. Black should be about equal. But as I said, bishop e6 was played immediately. f5 and Fischer took on b3. I cannot imagine him taking on b3 in any of these later games. It just doesn't make too much sense strategically. He does get the b4 square, which controls the main hole in Najdorf types of structures, d5, but it's not enough. So c takes b3, knight b4. And bishop g5, of course. Now bishop g5 is a very, very standard move. It does two things. Firstly, it defends e4 indirectly, because you're able to take on f6. It also controls d5, preventing d5 by black, which is a pawn break black would love to play, getting rid of the backwards pawn. And most importantly, it controls d5 once again, so that white may eventually be able to play knight d5. And yeah, here Fischer made a bad mistake, which you could say is actually a blunder. He should have gone d5. And d5, even though black now has the option to take on f6, is the best idea, because after bishop f6, e d5, you can now play e4. And knight e4 really isn't good because of bishop b2. And if you don't do anything, well, I'm eventually gonna win this pawn. If you turned on the engine here, it says bishop c4 is the best move to defend the pawn, e3. Now, white is better because Fischer made a mistake and gave up his bishop pair, but this pawn should provide a lot of play. For example, rook e8 here, and white has to babysit the pawn. White also has to set up a blockade of the e-pawn. Not easy. But against bishop g5, Fischer played a very bad move, rook e8, and see if you can punish this. I mean, it's actually really simple to punish this. You play bishop b5, and the rook just has to go back, unless you want to give up the exchange. If you play knight c6, well, then bishop takes, and knight d5, and this is a classical case of good knight versus bad bishop, where black is actually completely busted strategically. So he played rook e8, but his opponent, instead of gaining a huge advantage, almost winning, played bishop f3. So we're starting with a bad Fischer game in the Sicilian, and as we go along, you're gonna see better and better games. Okay, now it's relatively easy. The bishop is no longer well placed. It can no longer harass the rook. Most importantly, it can no longer get onto this diagonal controlling d5. So queen b6 check, king h1 is forced, and rook ac8. Okay, instead of this, he could have tried h6. This would have been better, bishop h4, and then once again d5. Positionally, you want to play d5. Strategically, you have to play d5 because that liberates your pieces. And once again, black can try bishop f6, e d5, but in this position, I can actually go rook a d8, and, well, I don't see an easy way to hold on to that pawn. Eventually, I'll be able to either attack it once again with my queen or double up my rooks down the d file and put too much pressure on the pawn. I may also consider e4. So, yeah, instead of h6, he played rook ac8, which is okay, not too bad. Rook g1 was played, makes sense. White wants to attack down the g file, but there is already a bit of tactical trouble brewing in this position. So, if we can imagine this knight ever landing on f2, then that would be checkmate. And especially since this bishop is undefended, let's imagine knight e4, forking the bishop and the f2 square, because the bishop cannot retreat to h4, it's controlled by the e7 bishop. So rook g1 makes sense, but it's tactically suspicious. Not that it's bad according to the engine, it's not a bad move, but as humans, when we play such moves in tournament games, we have to be aware of the possible tactical consequences and patterns that could arise because of our decision. Okay, it's dawning a bit now. I think you can see me a bit better. So Fischer played queen f2, and queen f2 puts pressure on b2. You have to do something about it. You cannot let your b2 pawn go, because then the c3 knight's hanging, and his opponent made a mistake. He could have played bishop e2, simply blocking the queen. He also could have taken on f6 and then played bishop e2, but he chose to trade queens. And tactically, trading queens actually helps me get this pattern in where I'm trying to land my knight on f2, because there's fewer defenders of that square. So queen e2, bishop e2, and he played knight c2. Now, knight c2 attacks the rook, so something has to be done about that. His opponent played rook ac1. Instead of that, Fischer could have tried going for this pattern immediately with rook c3. Well, what does rook c3 do? Rook c3 allows you to take on e4, which threatens the bishop and threatens f2. So something has to be done about that. Luckily for white, this knight is still hanging. So after g4, getting rid of the mating threat, black doesn't check on f2 because it makes no sense. Black also doesn't win the bishop on g5. Black just takes on c3. And for an exchange, black has a bit too much and black should be much better. But in the game, Fischer played knight c2. Rook ac1 was played. Knight d4, attacking the bishop, so you're threatening rook c3 followed by knight e2. So bishop c4. And in this position, Fischer played one move and his opponent resigned. So bishop c4 undefends the g4 square. e4 is still defended, but we can still go for the same pattern. Fischer played knight g4, threatening knight f2 mate and threatening bishop takes g5, winning a piece. His opponent resigned. This is dead even. There's a very, very simple solution to this problem. See if you can find it. So the way to defend this is actually very simple. Just give your king a square, defend the bishop. There's only one answer, h4. After h4, the game is equal. I don't know what to suggest for black. There are many moves. The engine wants to play rook c5. I don't think I'd play rook c5, but okay. In any case, his opponent resigned. But knight g4 is a very, very good example of just how a seemingly harmless move like rook g1 could get you into trouble. Of course, he should have seen that he isn't getting mated, but still. Okay, let's move on to Fischer's games when he was actually considered good. If you're looking for a more effective way to learn openings, try out Chessbook. It's a great tool for studying openings. It's very easy to use. It focuses on moves that people actually play. It explains the plans in certain positions, and it's going to highlight the mistakes you made in your games. So once you connect your lichess and chess.com accounts, it's going to focus on the mistakes you actually make. So you're going to be able to work on what matters most. You can import your repertoire either by hand or by, importing a PGN. So that's easy. Let's say save my progress. And you can then practice those moves. So if you go to, let's say, your black repertoire, you can see that mine is 89% complete. You can press import and you can use any of the PGNs I've prepared. You can find a bunch of them in the link description, in the description below. So import the repertoire and then you can start practicing it. So for example, if we go d4, d5, you can also have a bunch of pre-made repertoires from this position, and some of them are mine. I have created a Queen's Gambit declined opening repertoire for black, so you can start with that. I have created an e4, e5 full repertoire for black, and I have created the London system repertoire for white, and you can access them through Chessbook easily. So once again, once you connect your lichess and chess.com accounts, you're going to be able to correct your opening mistakes. So for example, in this case, I play h6 in the tile, and let's see what mistake I'd made. So in this position, you played e6, play the correct move on the board. Wait, what's the move? I think I should go bishop e4. No? And here, this is a good example. I don't know. Show me the answer. Queen e6 check. Yes. Okay. Damn. So you see what I'm talking about. I made the mistake in the game, and then once again, when I was reviewing it on Chessbook, I didn't know what to do. You can also practice all the moves in your repertoire, which is obviously one of the most useful things you can do. You can play through model games in your openings. You're going to get served games daily, and you can view performance by opening, which will be there once you complete your repertoire. Check out Chessbook by following the link in the description below. It's only $8 a month, even less if you pay yearly, and I hope you like it. When he was a grandmaster, this game was played against Paul II, the best Estonian player of all time, who is by Paul Keres. He's on the Estonian kroner note. I think it's 10 kroner or 5, which is old money they used to have before the euro. And then in 2016, Estonia actually came out with a commemorative €2 coin with Paul excuse me, with Paul Keres on it, and I have it. So if you'd like some money with Paul Keres, you can get a €2 coin or a banknote. In any case, Paul Keres is considered to be one of the greatest players never to become world champion. At this point in 1959, Bobby Fischer was 15 on 60 or 16, depending on the game. He was born in 43. And he was good, but he wasn't nearly as good as he was in, let's say, 65 or 62. So, after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d, knight f6, knight c3, we get the Najdorf. And this is what Fischer was most famous for. And Keres chose bishop g5. Now, bishop g5 is the critical line in the Najdorf. It's considered to be the main line. And it doesn't allow black to play e5. e5 is extremely risky with this bishop on this diagonal pinning the knight and the other bishop possibly coming to c4. So against bishop g5 you play e6, and this is the main line. f4, starting an attack, and there are a couple of ways to play here. You can play queen b6, going for the poisoned pawn variation, which we are going to see. I was going to show you a poisoned pawn game, but I actually didn't choose it. But queen b6 is one of the critical lines, going for the b2 pawn. Or you can play a simple developing move, which Fischer did in this game, bishop e7. So bishop e7 develops a piece, prepares to castle, although you don't have to if white starts a crazy attack. Queen f3 makes sense. You want to castle queenside, you want to put more pressure on the king side. Queen c7, a very important move. It plays against e5, and it also puts pressure on c3. So at some point, when the pieces have developed and the rook has managed to come to c8, this knight will be pinned in case white has already castled queenside. White castles, knight bd7. And here Keres played a very weird move. A move that I don't remember seeing. So the main move is g4. The only alternative, at least I thought, was bishop d3. And bishop d3 puts more pressure on the king side, makes perfect sense. g4 is a very concrete attacking move. Keres played bishop e2, which in my mind makes no sense at all. It doesn't defend c2, it doesn't attack h7, it doesn't continue the attack. So makes very little sense. Fischer played b5, perfectly fine. You give yourself the option to play bishop b7, which will support d5, and you are also expanding on the queen side. So, in this position, bishop takes f6 was played. Knight takes f6, you don't want to undefend the d-pawn. e5, okay, fine. And e5 attacks the knight, attacks the rook, and it takes good tactical understanding to figure all of this out. So when he played bishop e2, I think one of his ideas was actually to take, and if bishop takes, and if knight takes, to play e5, attacking the knight, attacking the rook, and the bishop is on e2, so that after bishop b7, he can sack the queen for a couple of pieces and have the bishop recapture on f3 so that the rook is attacked in the end of the line. So I think this may have been his prep in the bishop g5 Najdorf, although that's just me guessing. So b5, once again, bishop takes, knight takes, e5. So you cannot move the knight, because if you move it to d5, you lose a pawn. You cannot move it anywhere else because queen takes rook. And you don't have bishop b7 because your king is still on e8. So Fischer has to play bishop b7. Has to play bishop b7. Now, if you don't do anything, I mean, well, queen g3 is the best engine move. Attacks the knight, and then the queen also puts pressure on g7. But you're not going to continue with queen g3 if this is your prep. So he took on f6. So he took one piece. The bishop is attacked. And after he loses his queen, he recaptures with the bishop so that the rook is attacked and the bishop on e7 is attacked. So Fischer just played bishop takes f6, which I think makes more sense because it puts pressure on everything here. Bishop takes a8. And now It's, well, let's count the material. 2 knights, bishop, and 2 rooks for Keres, rook, bishop, queen for Fischer. So it should be about even material, but Fischer should have a close to winning position after the move queen c4. Now what does queen c4 do? It attacks this knight twice, and it also attacks the a2 pawn. So if you, for example, play knight d2, defending this knight, which then, or moving this knight away, defending this knight twice, which then defends a2, that doesn't really work because of bishop takes, knight takes, and then b4. And I'm dislodging the knight I'm going to take on a2, and I'm going to be better. Instead, Fischer played a very human move that makes a lot of sense. He played d5, simply trapping the bishop. Now, if I had white here, I would definitely play bishop c6 check. I cannot understand why Keres didn't do that. He played bishop takes d5. You can at least misplace the king. Not that Fischer would like to castle, maybe he won't castle, but one thing is certain, if king e7, then rook he1, and if you take this, then I just go knight d5. So it's not that easy to win this piece back. So after bishop c6, you actually have to go king f8. And once you go king f8, well, how do you get this rook out? Now it's queen and bishop versus a bunch of pieces. The engine says equal, so the engine plays like g6, king g7, gets the king in. But for a human, I think playing with the king on f8 and having to solve this problem is way more difficult. So on d5, I think he should have played bishop c6. Instead, he played bishop d5. Which again, according to the engine, is fine. It's the evaluation is the same. I just don't understand it from a human perspective. Okay, so Fischer didn't take on d5, he took on d4, because now it's a double threat. If you move this bishop, then I take on c3 twice. So rook takes d4 and e takes d5. Okay, you could throw in rook check, and I mean, in this case, once again, the king has to go to f8, so I cannot understand why not. I think Keres should have thrown this in. I think it makes perfect sense. Instead, he played knight d5. The queen went to c5. And now he played rook e1 check. Okay, the queen really had no way to cover e1 easily, so excuse my request to play rook e1 earlier. So rook e1 here, king f8. You cannot go to d8, of course, because there's a discovered check. c3 defending the rook, and h5. And this is a very interesting imbalance. We have queen, rook, and 5 versus 2 rooks, knight, and 6. So basically, Fischer is up the exchange for a pawn. Okay, that's about it. Okay, Keres played f5. I love the move f5 because it's preparing to restrict the king from exiting this box, and if he can get in f6, it doesn't really matter whether Fischer advances or takes, the king is going to be severely restricted. Fischer played rook h6, which is an excellent move, and it plays against f6, but unfortunately you're not going to give up the exchange, so f6 anyway. He took with the g-pawn, at least the rook on h6 prevents knight takes. But now knight f4, and there's maybe something going on here. If we can imagine a rook on d7, a king on g7, and knight e6 check, well, yeah. So let's just set up a blunder. So let's say h4, a rook d7, king g7, knight e6 check, and game over. So there could be some trouble, but Fischer played precisely. h4, rook d8 check was played, king g7, and in this position Keres made what I think is the losing mistake. What he has to do here, and that's very hard to do when you see your opponent's king so exposed, is rook d4. Now why rook d4? It's not about the rook being on d4 or defending the knight, it's about preparing to move your rook to the back rank without allowing a queen infiltration. Rook d4 blockades the black queen, which is the only active black piece. So if you can restrict that queen, well, black isn't really playing with any pieces. Instead, Keres played rook e8. And again, that's very understandable you at least have a draw. If black doesn't do anything, you can just keep checking, or it's gonna be mate if black doesn't do anything. Like, for example, a5 and check, check, and here, mate. So it's an understandable move. But the queen is now coming in. Queen g1 check, king d2, queen f2 check. Okay, knight e2. Maybe Keres thought he was winning, but now rook g6. And not only is the king coming out, but the rook is now in the attack. He played g3 here, which is definitely losing. He should have forced the king to g5 to at least block the rook from coming into g2. But g3 blocks the rook all the same, but it doesn't work. Now f5, giving the king the f6 square. Now a check, but king f6. And my rook is still active. And if you don't do anything, I don't know what to suggest. The engine says, like, almost announces mate. This is minus a million. If you don't trade rooks, my rook is going to be much better than yours. So you really should take so that you don't get mated. F takes, gh4. And in this position, Fischer made a mistake. He should have taken on h4 first. He took on h2 first. The problem with taking on h2 is that the rook comes to d4 and then defends the h4 pawn, which then blockades the g5 pawn. So it becomes more complicated to win the game. Queen h4 is just over, because nothing can defend the h2 pawn, and you just march your passed pawns down the board. But queen h2, okay, rook d4, and now the game requires precision, because the queens are excellent in endgames where they have a lot of targets, and the rook and knight are very much restricted. And rook and knight is a very awkward combination of pieces, because they aren't good at defending each other unless there are good outposts. So let's say their places are reversed. The knight is on d4 on an outpost, and the rook is on e2. That makes more sense, but you need time to do that. Knight c1, queen g2 check, king b3, ba4 check, king a3. Yeah, the queen is too good, and the knight is too bad. The rook is a good piece on d4, but it's not going to be good for long. King f6, knight c5, attacking the a4 pawn, so rook a4. Queen e3 attacks the knight, and you can see that it's very, very hard for white to defend all the weaknesses, and also, more importantly, this pawn is just moving forward. So f4, I mean, I would have resigned here. Black is just gonna queen. So rook d4, trying to prevent that. King f5. The pawns are marching up the board. The h pawn is attacked. The knight is pinned. So king b3 and queen h4. Now you have two passed pawns. Now there's no stopping them. And white's c pawn is just miles away. Slowly, 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 Fischer marches the pawns up the board. Keres is forced to give up a piece. Now it's just queen versus rook, and it's hopeless. Unless you can queen one of your pawns. In this position, it's definitely resignable, and Keres even hung mate. So, not that he wouldn't have lost later on, regardless. And I thought this was a really interesting game, because this is one of his first major successes in the Najdorf, on the big tournament scene among the top players, and this was a big upset. To beat Keres in the Najdorf in this fashion is a big achievement. Now for my favorite game. This is Unzicker Fischer, and poor Unzicker is on the receiving end in my two favorite games probably of all time. One of them is Karpov Unzicker, where Unzicker is black in the Breyer, closed Spanish. And this one is where Unzicker is white in the Bishop e2 Najdorf. Poor Unzicker. He was a great player, and I actually like his style. It's just a coincidence. So, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d, knight f6, knight c3, Najdorf, and Unzicker plays bishop e2. And Fischer writes in his 60 memorable games, on and off, white resorts to this solid and still respected system, championed by Smyslov, whenever the sharper tries fail. So, I mean, bishop e2 is a relatively safe way to play, but not really. It's a bit safer than bishop g5, but the ideas behind it, if you play it correctly, are actually as sharp. So e5, Fischer plays the Najdorf with e5, when he faces bishop e2, knight b3, and bishop e6. And now this is the idea. He says provoking f4, f5, weakening white's king pawn, and that's very much true. If you can set up a target on e4, long term, positionally, you're going to be better. This is all theory. Castles, knight bd7, f4. You're not afraid of f5 because you can take on b3, queen c7, f5, and bishop c4. He doesn't take on b3, he plays bishop c4. The bishop's pinned to the rook, so you cannot really move it away. And let's look at this position strategically. In the Najdorf, black plays e5, giving away the d5 square. And that's the most common theme in the opening. So black would like to advance the d-pawn to get rid of the weakness, because the hole on d5 also creates a backwards d6 pawn. So white's dream position is a position where black is left with a dark squared bishop, let's say on e7, and white is left with a knight on d5. That's good knight versus bad bishop. So strategically, for white, trading everything but black's dark squared bishop off makes a lot of sense. So black has to be very careful with the trades in this position, especially against moves like bishop g5. Okay, white plays a4, and that's simply to prevent b5, which is a move black would like to play. In the Sicilian, in many Sicilians, and in the Najdorf as well, once the rook comes to c8, black can set up b5, b4, getting rid of this knight and then taking on c2. That's a very common theme. So playing against b5. Bishop e7 finally developing, and bishop e3. This is fine. Black castles and a5. Now, there are a couple of moves in this position, and Fischer gives g4 as the critical move, and it definitely does seem critical, because on g4 he writes d5, and if e d5, then knight b6, and let's say bishop b6, queen b6, king h1, bishop takes b3, c b3. You got rid of your weaknesses. The d-pawn is weak, d6 is coming, but tactically this can be justified. Or on d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5. He recommends knight f6, but you can also play knight b6. And for example, if d6, then bishop d6, bishop c4, queen c4, queen d6 is just bad for white, because you take on g4, then you play queen e4, then you take on e3, and so on. So this is the sharper way to play. a5, played by Unzicker, is the positional approach. You're trying to set up a blockade of black's b-pawn, because on b5 there's en passant, but also very importantly, you're giving yourself the option to further increase the control of the b6 square. So after something like knight a4, bishop b6, knight takes, you're attacking the rook, and the rook on c8, well, the rook is never coming to c8 because white takes. So it's here that black has to be very, very careful not to get a worse position. If you play something random, I don't know, rook c8, then knight a4. If you play h6, which is a passive move, an attack comes. So Fischer plays one of my favorite moves, and even though this is theory today, it wasn't that well known at the time. Fischer had a game against Stahl in 1962, the same year, a bit before this, which went in a similar fashion. But at this time, this was Fischer's sort of pet novelty against bishop e2, b5. And even though there's en passant, here's what he's trying to do. He is getting in exchanges that are going to force weaknesses in white's queen side. So this has to be taken. I don't think you have a choice. If you don't take this, well, I've just expanded. This is a weakness. You can never support it. Of course, any knight could come to c6, harassing that weakness and winning the pawn. So a takes b. Knight takes b, of course. And bishop takes b6 is played. In this position, Geller in Curaçao played king h1. The engine thinks king h1 is the best move. If you take on b6 trying to weaken this bishop, it doesn't work because queen b6 is check. If you take the bishop first, then knight takes c4, and, well, this is bad. I'm gonna take on b2. You do get bishop g5 and knight d5 as compensation, but I've just taken a pawn and weakened the c3 knight. So, yeah, you cannot do that. The best move on knight b6 is king h1. And Fischer writes, at Curaçao 1962, Geller had found the right line, king h1, rook fc8, bishop takes b6, queen b6. Because queen b6, oh, there are so many mosquitoes, I'm sorry, I have to chase them away. King h1 means that bishop takes b6, queen b6 isn't check. But in this position, Unzicker took immediately. Okay, now king h1. And now let's see what Fischer got. So, I wonder what you would play in this position. If you move the bishop away, if you trade the bishop on b3, then you're giving away control of d5. If you take on e2, you're helping white develop. So what he did is bishop to b5, and this is an incredible move. This whole idea of b5 and then bishop to b5 is, I think, it's just beautiful. So what's the point? He wants to play bishop c6 and then a5, dislodging this knight, a4, and then maybe d5. But most importantly, the bishop on c6 does two things. Firstly, it prevents knight d5 because I take and then I have a passed e-pawn because you're forced to take with the pawn. More importantly, you're never playing g4 because of this diagonal. e4 is weak, your king is weak, you have no attack. So bishop b5 is an incredibly strong retreat. You basically have to take because bishop c6 cannot be allowed. So you have to take. And now, after ab5, what do we have? He, I think, should have taken on b5 with the knight. I think that's a bit more promising. But now that he has taken with the bishop, we have a position in which after knight d5, which you're going to have to play sooner or later because I could play b4. After knight d5, queen d5, we have a way in on the queen side. And this is the whole point of the variation. If the bishop on b5 is taken, he plays rook a4. And I remember looking at this game for the first time, and I think this was one of the most instructive games I've ever seen when I first started playing chess. And this pattern of not moving the rook all the way and capturing, but setting it on an outpost, which enables you to double up the rooks, is one of the patterns that you see over and over again in strong players' games, and something that weaker players simply miss. In the Sicilian Defense, if black can get queenside play, either on the c file, b file, or the a file, then that usually distracts white from continuing on the king side. And this is one of Fischer's greatest ideas in the Sicilian. So if you take this rook, of course I take, your knight is misplaced, I take on b2, so you cannot take. c3 played, queen a6. Now you cannot move your knight because I just win your rook. You shouldn't move your rook away because I have rook a2. And Fischer says it's hard for white to hit upon a constructive plan. At Curaçao 62, that's the game I mentioned, Tal played against me rook a d1. And yeah, in this case, h3 was played, creating luft, but creating dark squared weaknesses. Rook c8, okay, maybe the rook's coming to c5, maybe the rook's coming to c4, putting pressure on e4. If the rook comes to c4, how do you plan to defend the e4 pawn? You cannot play knight d2 because rook a1. Rook fe1, defending the pawn in advance. h6, luft. King h2, not doing anything. And bishop g5. Bishop g5 is a very, very strong move. I mean, it prepares bishop f4. And it actually provoked a weakness from Unzicker, which was proven to be deadly later on. He should have played, I don't know, the engine thinks black is better, but it's almost fine for white. It's like -1, and the engine plays moves like queen d3, which I don't understand why you would play that, but okay. Unzicker played g3. And now, queen a7. Look at how he's targeting every single weakness. If this rook on a4 is taken, we still take with the pawn, targeting b2 eventually. So king g2 preventing queen f2. And now rook a2. Once again, an amazing move down the a file. Now I'm just threatening to take on b2. What can you do? You cannot take this rook. Okay, if rook takes a2, then queen takes a2. And if you try to defend the b pawn with rook e2, then I just take on c3. Your rook's hanging. So in the game, king f1 was played, which is arguably even worse. And after this, Fischer just took on c3. And that was the end of the game. If you take this rook, queen f2 is mate. It's very hard to suggest a move. The engine plays queen d3 here, says black is losing, but not immediately. Basically, you have to defend the c3 pawn. So this is, I think this is an absolutely astonishing game. If you don't know this game, please study this position on your own once again. So b5, a b6, knight b6, bishop b6, queen b6, king h1, and now bishop b5. Preparing bishop c6, putting the bishop on this diagonal, chasing the knight away, getting pressure on these two pawns. A really great idea. Now, another poor player that keeps getting smashed by Fischer is Robert Byrne. And if I could, I would apologize to him, because he is most famous for getting destroyed by Fischer. Now, this was a bishop c4 Najdorf. So once again, a Najdorf, and you could also call this a Fischer-Sozin by transposition. So basically, this is what Fischer almost always played against the classical Sicilian. I'm gonna call it the bishop c4 Najdorf. e6. So when the bishop is on this diagonal, you don't play e5. It becomes way too dangerous. Bishop b3. This is fine. Theory. b5 f4. Okay, bishop b7, f5. And this line is known to be very aggressive, but not very good. Black is already slightly better, and black plays e5. Well, why do you play e5 now and you didn't play it beforehand? Now the f5 square isn't available for the knight, so it's slightly less dangerous. Knight d2. This is theory. Knight bd7, bishop g5. Once again, the same pattern in the Najdorf, playing for d5. This is the same way e4 is the key square in the Nimzo-Indian. That's d5 in the Sicilian Najdorf. Most Najdorf games are going to revolve around d5. Okay, bishop e7, knight g3. This is looking scary already, but it's not really that scary. In this position, Fischer should have played h5, and I'm going to show you why. If you play h5, there's no knight h5. Why knight h5? Because knight h5 removes the defender of the d5 square. Once again, strategically, you have to keep control over d5. If you don't, white's going to end up in that dream position we had already mentioned, where black is left with the bishop on e7, and white has a knight on d5. So he should have gone h5 simply to prevent knight h5. Instead, he went rook c8. And rook c8 is also a good idea. I mean, if you castle, like Byrne did, now maybe I'm setting up tricks like these. Okay, so rook takes c3 followed by knight e4 is a well-known pattern in the Najdorf. However, since h5 hasn't been played, Byrne could have gotten an equal or even slightly better position by exploiting that. So he should have taken bishop f6, and on knight f6, now knight h5. And Fischer has to play very precisely to have something close to equality. If you play the best engine line, then okay, you're good. But I don't know if he would have found this. So he should play rook c3 here, knight f6 check, bishop f6, bc3, bishop e4. So it's the bishop pair for the exchange, and obviously white has a ton of weaknesses. So if you play this way, you're going to have a slight edge, but if you don't, you're just going to be worse. So on rook c8, knight h5 was very powerful. Unfortunately, Byrne castled. Unfortunately for him, that is. Now Fischer plays h5. And now there's no more knight h5. And h4 is suspicious. I mean, I don't know what to suggest. When your opponent has a knight on g3 or g6 or b3 or b6, you push the h-pawn or the b or the a-pawn to dislodge that knight. However, in this case, playing h4 creates a bunch of weaknesses, and the most notable is the g4 square. Not that it's going to be important, but it could be important. Let's imagine this rook on e1 defending the pawn, the knight on g4 and queen b6 check. Do you resign? I mean, it seems like a deadly attack. So allowing knight g4, or not giving yourself the option to prevent knight g4 or to chase the knight away, seems dubious to me. Okay, Fischer now continues his attack on the queen side, and it's perfectly justified. b4. Now, we know that the bishop on g5 is meant to take on f6 to weaken d5, so Byrne throws in bishop f6. Bishop f6 and knight d5. Unfortunately, he played h4. So, you know, bishop h4. Now, do you want to take on h5? I wouldn't want to take on h5. It seems suicidal to take on h5, but what else do you do? I think he has to take. So knight h5 activating the rook, queen g5 defending g7. And attacking the knight, double attacking the knight, so f6. And now you really don't want to take that knight. The engine says taking the knight is fine, but there's rook f5, there's stuff like this to calculate, there's knight c7 followed by queen d6. No human would play this, and Fischer just played a simple g6, and now there are no more tricks. No more tricks. Knight g7. Oh yeah, there's one more trick. You cannot go to f8 here. If you go to f8, you could lose. Why? Because you're setting yourself up for queen d6 being checked. So he went to d8. If king f8, then knight f4. This is a remarkable move. It's opening up the queen to d6. If you take that knight, you're busted. Queen d6 check. There's a bishop here, there's a knight here. You're losing. I don't know. I don't know what to suggest. The queen is just going to take on d7. So he played king d8. Very precise. Rook f3 trying to defend, but it's a bit too late. Bishop g3. Now you will see the consequences of the open h file. Queen d3, double attacking the bishop, so bishop h2. King f1 forced. Knight c5 attacks the queen, attacks the bishop. Rook h3. And he's hoping to set up some tricks. If you take the queen, then rook takes h8 and so on. So Fischer very calmly just plays rook h4. Another perfect rook move that doesn't move the rook all the way. Queen f3. I don't know where else to put the queen. It's attacked. So knight takes bishop, opening up the rook. Now the rook is attacking the c2 square. A b3. Rook h3, you cannot take with the pawn because of queen g1. So queen takes is forced. And now bishop takes d5. Just getting rid of his bad bishop, getting a passed pawn. Queen f6 check. Okay, bishop d5 undefended f6. Your knight is hanging. So after king e1, he didn't take the knight. Why would he take the knight? He played queen f4. And this sets up mating threats. So the threat is bishop g3 followed by queen f2, and then the rook comes into play. It's very hard to suggest a move. I don't know. Byrne resigned here. If rook d1, then bishop g3. And that's it. What else? If queen f3, giving the king the f1 square, it doesn't matter. King f1, rook c2, and I'm just gonna play rook f2 check. So nothing works. So yeah, a remarkable game. I mean, I hope you liked it. Now the final game I'm going to show you is, sadly, Fischer's final game. This is the last game of the 72 World Championship match, the game after which Fischer became world champion, and the last game of competitive chess Fischer ever played. also his last Sicilian games. Now, you may notice that I'm not counting his 92 match against Spassky as competitive chess, because it really wasn't. It was a delusional idea that he's fighting for the world championship, and even though his chess was still at an astonishingly high level, he was out of date when it comes to theory, when it comes to shape, and he would have, I think, been destroyed by, let's say, Kasparov at the time. That's just my opinion. But yeah, my opinion. In any case, e4, c5, knight f3, e6. Fischer playing not the French variation of the Sicilian, but either the Khan or the Taimanov. This is interesting to me because he played this very, very rarely. d4, cd4, knight d4, a6, the Khan, and after knight c6, this now becomes the Taimanov. And the Taimanov is a very respectable variation, which personally I don't like with either color. Bishop e3, knight f6. Bishop d3 is probably the most common move, but queen d2 is sharper, so is f4. So bishop d3 is, yeah, let's have a normal game. In this position, queen c7 is one of the main ideas, preventing or fighting against an eventual e5 after f4, but d5 was played, and this is fine. This leads to slightly more equal positions. You should take, so ed5, ed5. We have an IQP position, which is very rare unless the opening is the Alapin, and then white has an IQP. In the Sicilian, having an IQP is not that common. Castles, bishop d6, knight c6, bc6. This is all still relative theory, but it's kind of outdated for 1992, for 1972, even then. Bishop d4, castles, queen f3. Now, Spassky sets up this idea of taking on f6, giving up the bishop pair and creating weaknesses. This, when you have the option to do this, you should be extremely careful because you're giving away the bishop pair. And even though there are weaknesses, and in this case there will be a weakness on f6, you really have to think hard about how you can target that weakness, and more importantly, whether you can set up a blockade on the square in front of the weakness. So if you end up taking, ideally you'd like to do something like this. When there are doubled pawns and no pawns on adjacent files, getting a knight to blockade that pawn, especially on the f5 square, could be game over. So strategically this could work. Fischer has to be careful. He played bishop e6, saying, okay, take. Not that he can do much, he doesn't really want to play bishop e7. Rook fe1, c5, forcing Spassky to make a decision, and Spassky does take. Queen takes, pawn takes, rook ad1. Now, he played rook ad1. I think knight e2 is a bad move because you lose your bishop, so you cannot do that straight away. You also don't really want to move your bishop away to give the knight the square. So, yeah, you kind of don't have the option to do this yet, although you really would love to do it. Unfortunately, c4 would then undefend the knight. So setting up this ideal blockade doesn't really work. Rook ad1, rook fd8, bishop e2, getting away from c4 and maybe putting the bishop on a more promising square, rook ab8, b3 defending, and c4. I think c4 is a very instructive move because it undermines the structure. Fischer has the bishop pair, so he wants the position to open up. He wants an open center with many targets. And if you don't do anything, I'll just take on b3. The d5 pawn is hanging, but not really, because I have bishop h2 in the end, winning the exchange. So it's very interesting to see that Spassky did actually choose to do this. He played knight d5, rook d5, bishop h2, king h2 is forced, and rook takes. And after bishop c4, what did we get? We got a position where Spassky is going to be up a few pawns, I mean, probably. But he's down the exchange. However, Fischer doesn't really have that much to work with, and this really shouldn't be winning for black. Practically speaking, the engine of course says it's fine for white, it's equal. So rook d2. Bishop d3 was interesting, but instead he took on a6. I think he should have played bishop d3. Rook c2, rook e2, and Spassky trades. Now, this is an interesting imbalance. If you showed me this position, I wouldn't have any idea which side I would like to choose. So please comment below for this position, because trust me, I was analyzing this and playing it out against myself for hours, trying to win with black, trying to win with white when I thought white was winning, trying to win with black when I thought black was winning, and I managed to win with both sides. I'm not an engine, I'm not Spassky, I'm not Fischer, so I blundered probably dozens of times. So please let me know which side you would choose here. If you were forced to play this in a tournament game, which side would you choose? So rook d8 played, a4. Okay, seems interesting. Rook d2 attacks the bishop, attacks the f2 pawn, bishop c4. You shouldn't take on f2. If you take on f2, you are going to lose. Rook f2, a5, rook a2, a6, and then b4, b5, and the pawn queens, so rook a2. Now this prevents a5, it also prevents b4, so you're kind of stuck. King g3 defending the pawn, king f8. And the engine still says equal. But it was at this point, and I got something similar in my own analysis, that I started liking black. Because if the queenside pawns don't move forward, well, what do you do? Whereas black has a pretty clear plan. I want to create a passed pawn on the h file. I want to trade my f6 pawn for your g2 pawn. And then I have a passed pawn. So g4, which I think is... I mean, the engine says fine, but from a human perspective, you're making this trade much easier for me. So no. f5, now I'm gonna have a passed pawn. If Spassky could play f3 here, I'm sure he'd be able to draw. But since you cannot defend this pawn with another pawn, that means that the h pawn is gonna be unopposed. So gf5, f6, I have a passed h pawn, you don't have anything. Bishop g8, h6, king g3. Now, again, the engine says equal, but it doesn't matter. What matters is whose position is easier to play. I have to apologize for the noises of the traffic. It's about 6 a.m. The village is waking up, and for some reason, people are going around on their motorcycles at 6 a.m. King d6, king f3. Now, king f3 is the first losing mistake. Why? Because, well, I may just be able to cut you off with rook a1, rook g1. If I play rook a1, rook g1, you're going to be cut off. So rook a1, king g2 played. So he basically wasted 2 moves. King e5, now I'm coming in. Bishop e6 defending. King f4, I'm coming in. Yeah, the 2 moves that Spassky lost with king f3 are crucial. Rook b1 attacking the pawn, you have to defend. Rook b2, bishop c4, rook a2, you cannot move your pawns. So either bishop moves or the king moves. h5 by Fischer, bishop d7, and Spassky resigned. That's the end of the game. It's very easy for white to win now. If I go king g4, and you play b4, I go h4, and you play, let's say, well, a5, to make sure you don't lose the pawn, and your idea is to do this, and then move the bishop, and then do this. That doesn't work. h3 check. If you go king h2, then I take on f2. If you go king f1, then I play rook b2. And after, let's say, b5, I go h2. Bishop c6, okay, defending, rook b1, and after king g2 I queen with mate, after king somewhere else I win your bishop, then I win all of your pawns. So Spassky resigned at some point when the game was adjourned, and I think this was a very sad end to the match. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make this video about the 72 match, but I was always, even though Fischer is my favorite player, I always felt bad for Spassky for having lost in such a fashion. Okay, so those were my favorite Fischer Sicilian games from the black side. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, comment below, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.